In this day and age, I don't reckon there's a single soul who hasn't heard of the Outlast games. One of the biggest names in the horror game scene, and rightfully considered one of the scariest games ever made. Not only that, but it might also be one of the most historically relevant horror games of its decade. Besides being a terrifying, insane experience, Outlast as a product almost single-handedly revived the horror game scene, and influenced pretty much everything that came after. The year of 2012 was kinda miserable for horror games. With the massive hit that was Resident Evil 4, almost every horror game that came after started to lean much more towards action, while the horror itself got pushed aside. The community dissatisfaction kept growing and growing until shit finally hit the fan with the release of the dreaded Resident Evil 6, which embodied basically everything wrong with the modern horror games. But then, in 2013, the indie company Red Barrel suddenly turned the table with their debut game, Outlast. Not only the game had an absurd level of quality considering the studio size, but it also was a pure horror experience. It was brutal, graphic, and as scary as it gets. And going against all odds, Outlast completely blew up when it released. Everyone wanted to play Outlast and watch other people playing it. Many YouTubers and streamers started playing the game, and its popularity only grew. Whether it was a calculated move or just the hand of fate working, it doesn't matter. That was the starting point for the Outlast ascension. In Outlast, we play as Miles Upshur, an investigative journalist who receives an anonymous tip that the giant pharmaceutical company Murkoff were conducting inhuman experiments on the patients of Mount Massive Asylum. He reaches the place, but something feels off. The place is completely dark, empty, and military vehicles parked outside. Miles gets in through a window and soon realizes the mistake he just made. The place is completely locked down. All staff and security have been brutally murdered, and the patients are at loose inside the building. In the library, Miles finds one of the guards still alive, impaled on a piece of metal. And before dying, he tells Miles to get out of there immediately. This opening scene of the game is nothing short of amazing. Nothing really happens, you're not in any real danger, but the tension is ever present. You see people running around in the distance, you enter these dark places recording all this blood and mauled bodies, knowing very well that each step you take is a step away from safety. And after much anticipation, we finally have our first contact with one of the patients.
Little pig.
And so, the nightmare begins. As we explore the interior of the asylum, the game takes that found footage movie format, where we don't just try to survive and escape, but also record as much as we can to expose Murkoff when, or rather if, we make it out alive. All the game's mechanics revolve around using the camera. You can use the zoom to see further away, and you can record important places and events to unlock more lore on your notebook. And of course, there's the iconic night vision mode, which became the hallmark of the Outlast series. The game frequently puts you in these dark places where you're forced to use the night vision to see, with this very limited field of vision where at any moment something can jump right in front of you. And on top of that, you still need to worry about finding batteries for the camera. Because the only thing worse than being alone in the dark is not being alone. And as you all know very well, Outlast doesn't really have any combat. The gameplay is very straightforward and focused on the exploration. Whenever enemies appear, our only option is to run and hide. This is a point many people criticize about this game, but I kinda see the point. By making the player completely defenseless, the game reinforces the threat that the patients pose to you. It's not that Miles can't defend himself, but it just wouldn't do any good. Because no matter how much Miles fought, these things just seem unstoppable. It gives the idea that the patients are no longer humans, but literally monsters. Throughout the game, we explore different areas within the asylum, in search of an exit. The place is huge and has this labyrinthic vibe to it, making you feel lost inside its walls. And the deeper we go into the asylum, the more we discover about the terrible experiments Murkoff was conducting on the patients. In the first Outlast game, we still had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went, but it was pretty clear that Murkoff was evil. Like, really evil. The guys at Red Barrels managed to create a company so evil it makes Umbrella looks like the Red Cross. The level of cruelty, the torment they cause people with zero remorse, and even worse, the brainwashing and the social engineering they practice puts any biological weapon to shame. Most of the lore you find in this game is about Murkoff, how it operated, where the patients came from, and what kind of experiments they were conducting there. Outlast story is a really good one. It gets you by surprise with a very well crafted narrative, a ton of lore, and an array of very interesting characters, which is kinda rare in a horror game. I find it really impressive how even though the game is focused on horror, atmosphere, jump scares and chases, they still found the time to build a story so well rounded, with an immersive and non-intrusive narrative that unfolds in real time while you play. At times even slowing the pace down and taking a break from the horror just to give space for the story to unfold. And of course, in the meantime, Miles comes face to face with some of the most bizarre patients of the asylum, also called variants. Mount Massive's clinic was for the criminally insane, so you can guess no one there was a saint. But Murkoff's experiments only seem to have made them worse. Turned them into literal monsters, bloodthirsty and devoid of any morals. And funny enough, those are the real stars of the game. Outlast's story is almost completely carried on the shoulders of the secondary characters. Thanks to them, even though the game taking place in one location, being the same experience from beginning to end, and Miles not being that great of a protagonist, it never gets boring. Because every character we meet in this game is unique, and each one brings something new to the table. You hate them and you're afraid of them, but at the same time you can't help but get attached to the character's personality. The first enemy we meet in the game is Chris Walker, a huge and very strong man with the skin on his nose and forehead ripped off. As it is said in the comics, Chris used to be a security guard of Murkoff's, but the experiments ended up affecting him as well, which turned him violent, and Murkoff then threw him in with the other patients. Now he's a massive monster who kills anyone that crosses his path, with his bare hands. Walker is sort of the main villain of the game. We go through a lot of places, face a lot of enemies, and still, Chris is always around somewhere, looking for us. We escape from Walker in the sewers and fall straight into the hands of Dr. Richard Traeger, a former Murkoff investor who, after causing troubles for Murkoff, ended up in Mount Massive, where he created this Doctor persona. Now he roams around the asylum performing surgeries on his patients using his giant pair of scissors. He captures Miles and straps him to a wheelchair, driving him around the asylum and delivering a nonsensical monologue about the means of production and capitalism, maybe a reflex of when he was a businessman. He then takes Miles to a dirty toilet and cuts off Miles' fingers, in what is likely one of the most unnerving scenes I ever seen in a video game. Outlast was bold in its horror. Not just by how much it was scary and unnerving, which is usually bad for sales, but it also had too much graphic content and violence. The whole game you are surrounded by blood, guts, corpses and violence. No filter at all. And they didn't stop at just the gore. Inside the Mount Massive Asylum, Miles witnessed all kinds of horrors, cannibalism, necrophilia, and worst of all, dicks. You know who I'm talking about. In the prison area of the asylum, we find maybe the most disturbing enemies of the game, the twins. Two bizarre looking men, cannibals who walk around with weapons and completely naked. They're not completely hostile, but they frequently try to kill you. And the sections where they appear are simply the worst ones, because these motherfuckers make absolutely no noise. And when they speak to you, they talk with this calm and extremely disturbing tone, which may give you the sensation that the twins are not that crazy, they just like what they're doing. And as if it wasn't enough to have all these maniacs roaming around, there also seem to be other things loose in the asylum, unnatural things. But not all characters in the game are really hostile to you. Right at the beginning of the game, we meet Father Martin, a variant who believes he's a priest, who claims to hear the voice of God and preaches his word to the other patients. Seems like in the middle of all that chaos and violence, some sort of religion took form among the patients. They seem to hear this voice of God coming from the TV static and they pray to it. Martin also talks about a prophecy that Miles must witness to the end. He doesn't attack Miles, but also won't let him live before his mission is complete. He also guides Miles throughout the game until in the end, performing his ultimate sacrifice. It's no stretch to say that Outlast is a 10 out of 10 horror game, a masterful mix of simple but engaging gameplay, beautiful visuals, immersive storytelling, a lot of personality, and a comically large spoon of fear. After almost dying multiple times, losing his fingers and seeing the only somewhat friendly person in the building burned on a cross, Miles finally manages to access the main elevator of the asylum. The game baits you, making you think the torture is finally over. But no, the elevator keeps going down to an underground Murkoff lab, where they were researching the Project Walrider. In the lab, we get the final pieces of the game's story, that shows us that everything up until this point wasn't supernatural or religious, but technology. The Walrider project was led by Dr. Rudolf Wernicke, a Nazi scientist who was brought to the United States as part of the Operation Paperclip, where he soon ended up in the hands of Murkoff, where he started to develop the morphogenic engine. A machine that used the tortured and fragile minds of patients to put them into a state of lucid dreams, where they would give life to a conscious ghost-like entity called the Walrider. The ghost we see running around that's actually made of nanorobots. The whole point behind everything Murkoff did was that for the morphogenic engine to work, the host needed to have an extremely fragile and disturbed mind. Reason why all the patients were constantly physically and psychologically tortured. In the lab, we meet Dr. Wernicke himself, and he tells us that the Walrider cannot leave that place. That if he was to enter a human host and escape, there will be no stopping him. Which ironically is the same reason why Chris Walker killed everyone inside, talking about containment measures. In a very distorted and insane way, Chris Walker was doing the right thing. And we then reach the final part of the game, where Miles needs to shut down the morphogenic engine while being chased by the Walrider. And with a lot of effort, Miles, barely alive, managed to stop the morphogenic engine and kill the Walrider, but not without being seriously injured in the process. The music then kicks in and Miles starts limping towards the exit, and for a brief moment you start to believe you've reached the happy end. However,
becomes a host. Jesus God, what is that thing?
the end. Or is it? Because 6 months later, Outlast received a DLC called Whistleblower, which shows us the point of view of Waylon Park, a Murkoff employee who tries to leak information about what was happening in there. He sends the email that Miles receives at the beginning of the game, but is caught red-handed by Murkoff security and the CEO, Jeremy Blair. Waylon is imprisoned and placed inside the morphogenic therapy along with the other patients. He witnessed the moment the Walrider breaks free and starts killing everyone, and takes the opportunity to escape along with the other patients. In Waylon's journey we get a different perspective on the game's events. We go through different places at different times and encounter different variants, like the cannibal with the circular saw and the one who might be the most handsome enemy in the game, Eddie Gluskin, also known as the Groom, a loving and passionate variant who roams around the asylum looking for candidates to become his bride. And you can guess what that entails. At one point, Waylon is captured by the Groom, who knocks him out, and it's during that time that Miles' journey happens. He then wakes up hours later when the shit already hit the fan and the Groom is about to cut off something very important to him. Waylon's DLC is short and very straightforward, but it adds a lot to the story, giving us context about what happened before the beginning of the game, but mainly what happens after. At the end of the DLC, we see Waylon reaching the asylum's main entrance with the sun rising on the horizon. He reaches the main lobby where he's attacked by Jeremy Blair, who stabs him. And then we finally discover what really happened to Miles. Waylon takes the opportunity to escape and drives away in Miles' car, in the last second seeing Miles himself walking out the door, now the new host of the Walrider. The game then cuts off to Waylon in a dark room, talking to a mysterious man, who gives him a choice: forget everything and go back to his normal life, but let Murkoff win, or publish Murkoff's information and say goodbye to his life forever. And thus began the bizarre universe of Outlast, with all of its characters, mystery, and the convoluted lore that Red Barrel's been building throughout the years. What started as a single game became a whole ass series, and what started in the asylum escalated into a much bigger, worldwide conspiracy. Everyone knows the giant comeback that was Resident Evil 7, and how much it was inspired by PT. But not enough is said about the influence Outlast itself had in both these games and pretty much every other horror game that came after. Besides giving the whole ass industry a lesson on how to make good horror games, it also served as a catalyst for the indie horror explosion that came afterwards. There's no denying Outlast had a huge impact on the industry. It proved that horror games still had potential, that people still liked the traditional horror games. No gimmicks, no explosions, no over-the-top action, just a good old, scary video game. Well guys, that was all I had to say. Hope you guys liked the video, and if you did, consider liking and subscribing to the channel. I see you on the next one. Bye bye.